Hi everyone. The painting that you see next to me is one that I recently finished. It's watercolor on paper, mounted on canvas, and coated with multiple layers of an acrylic varnish, so the surface is very well protected. I even have a layer of UV varnish on the very surface that's removable. This enables me to exhibit these paintings without the need to frame them behind glass, so I can hang them just like acrylic on canvas paintings. For a while now, I've concentrated exclusively on my painting, and I've produced a new body of work using this process. So I'm finally ready to jump back into making videos, and I'll recreate this large painting on a smaller scale for my next new painting video. And of course, in the video, I'll guide viewers through every step of the painting process. Hope you enjoy watching my new video. This is a brief introduction to the tools and materials that I used in this video. For a more complete discussion, please see my video entitled Tools and Materials for Watercolor Painting. I have a limited palette that I use, and my favorite colors happen to be Winsor Blue, French Ultramarine Blue, Cerulean Blue, Cobalt Blue, Raw Sienna, Brown Madder, Winsor Red, Cadmium Scarlet, Quinacridone Magenta. I sometimes use the neutral tint, Yellow Ochre, Aeolian Yellow, Winsor Yellow, and Cobalt Blue. All the greens that you see in this palette are mixed. That's a combination of Winsor Blue and French Ultramarine Blue. That's a combination of Winsor Yellow and Cobalt Blue. And the paper that I prefer is Arches. Arches 140-pound cold-pressed paper. I paint with sable watercolor brushes. And I use Winsor Newton. This happens to be a number 7 round, and this is a number 4 round. Here we see a rigger, a number 5 rigger. That's for doing linear, detail, lines. Beautiful brush. And I do use this quite often for splattering water, not really for painting, and at least in this type of subject. The water bottles that you're accustomed to seeing me work with in other videos for dispensing small amounts of water. And I like to wet my paint either with a plastic squeeze bottle or with a spray bottle like this. And of course, sponges. Always have an assortment. There's a natural sponge. There's a synthetic sponge. And the only eraser that I ever use on my watercolors is a kneaded eraser. I'm about to start painting, and I'm going to begin with this area of the watercolor. The reason why is because all these tiny little shapes are, number one, light in value, except for that these are deep red, but the other element, they have lots of spaces in between that would normally have to be painted very carefully. I like to paint them first, then mask them. Then I'm free to simply flow my paint around there and not have to worry about the detail of going around them. Let's begin to add the color. Looking closely at this, you see this is a very light yellow. It looks like, in my opinion, a little bit of aureolin yellow mixed with a little bit of cobalt blue. I'm going to go to my green palette. These are all mixed greens, and I'll discuss them in detail a little later on. I'm going to wipe out a section of the palette. I have some aureolin yellow in this plastic container. I added water, and I'm going to mix it. I don't mix the entire quantity of paint up. I leave the thickened tube paint in there also, and then just dilute a little bit of the watercolor. For purposes of mixing, I'm going to put a little bit of diluted cobalt blue over there that I'll eventually be using. Right now I want to keep it unmixed. Working with my number 4 brush, begin to lay in the delicate little anthers. See some shapes here that I didn't draw in. I don't go crazy when I'm drawing that in. Often I'll add as I go along. Also, the anthers are attached to something called filaments. I'm going to hold off on them right now. I will be adding them. But why don't we put in some of the reds over here. Get a few of these little things. This is the stigma over here. These are the anthers, the filaments, the stigma. What I would like to do with the stigma is simply use cadmium scarlet. Very intense red, but I believe it's appropriate for that. If I work with the tip of my brush, I'm working very delicately in areas like this, and at most of the time, I never work with the tip directly because that's a way to ruin a good brush. I always work on a slight angle. I would never have my brush down like that. You wear out the tip and wear out the brush prematurely. When this is dry, I'll mask it out. To paint the petal areas, what I do is I first dampen them. This is how I like to do it. Notice even when I flow the clean water, I'm working with the side of my brush, the body of the brush, not the tip of the brush. See how I mop it around? And I'm painting on Archer's 140-pound cold-pressed watercolor paper. Beautiful paper. I like to dampen the paper first so the color washes that I apply to the surface don't bite into the paper itself, but sort of float on top of the dampened area. And the beauty of watercolor is paint will only flow within the dampened area, unless, of course, you pull it out of that area. Looking at the petal, I see how it's a combination of Winsor yellow and cadmium scarlet. Over here, we get into a quinacridone magenta added with a little bit of cobalt blue. My first application is going to be the lightest colors, the mixture of yellow and cadmium scarlet. And then into that, I'm going to flow the darker color. I work wet into wet. It's my Winsor yellow. Get a little of that onto the palette. Add a little plain water to that. I didn't have to add any additional red to it because I had the cadmium scarlet on the side, and that's all I really need. Okay, I'm adding my yellow base color. Still working with my brush on that angle. Pulling the color down. I'm going to pull the yellow into what will eventually become deepish red. This is a combination of the quinacridone magenta and the cadmium scarlet. Paint that's been there and is still good to use. That's the beauty of watercolor. I rarely clean out my palettes because a lot of what's in the palette, pre-mixed color, is very useful, and all it has to do is be dampened. I study the subject matter to determine where the shadows and highlights are. And then I flow the paint in there to suggest a look at that. I'm going to go to quinacridone magenta. I want it darker there, so I'm going to start dropping it in this way. And then I lift my brush. And where I lift my brush, it's going to pull. Notice I'm not blending my color. I'm going to let it do its own thing. I have enough confidence in watercolor that the color will mix appropriately on its own. But at this wet stage, I can still put color in. It's wet enough. Notice this, I don't know if you can see it in the video. There's enough moisture on the surface to allow me to add more color. And what I want to add is this mixture of cadmium scarlet and Winsor yellow. It's a very orange color, and I need it. That's exactly what I want. Don't make the mistake of attempting to blend your color on the paper. Let it blend naturally. The beauty of watercolor, transparent watercolor technique, is to permit the watercolor to do its own thing. The surface of the petals, and even the surrounding foliage, is very wet. And one way I begin to suggest that look is to try to reproduce the motley quality of the surface by splattering a little water into the surface, causing, I don't know if you can call it a background or what, but what happens is a splattering action will begin to move the paint around on its own. I'm not working the brush to do it. I'm allowing it to happen on its own, and it'll suggest an interesting texture that I can't possibly achieve any other way. Salt would be a possibility, but it's way too extreme. I don't like using salt because, in my opinion, it looks a little gimmicky. But I use this quite often. Another thing that I haven't added is the veins. Well, they're very soft focus, and I'm going to wait till it's dry to add the veins. I have a technique that I think you're going to like. My pigment is ready to go because it's the same color that I used in the previous petal. Flowing in the yellowish color, and I see transitions in this petal from light to dark, so I'm going to try to work that in as I flow in these colors. It's not uniformly the same yellow. Notice not the tip of the brush, the side of the brush up against the paper. Now I'll get a little bit more of the red into that. Pick up a shadow over here. And I'm going to work in some more of that stronger orange mixture into this entire section. Wet into wet is good, but as soon as I get to a certain degree of dryness, I have to stop this because it'll result in back runs. Right now, though, no problem. Now, working quickly, I want to introduce that strong magenta area right there. I'm paraphrasing what I see. I'm not attempting to copy it. I have no desire to do that. I can't make a better looking flower than nature has done, so why copy it? Into that, I'm going to work the deeper quinacridone magenta, cobalt blue combination, and let it bleed. There we go. Can actually get a little of that down here too, because it'll continue to bleed in. That's still wet enough. That was a dangerous thing to do if it wasn't wet enough, but it is wet enough, and it'll bleed nicely, creating that very dark interior look. Now, this is drying relatively fast, and I do want to create a more motley surface by splattering in, so there I go. Oh, it's doing it. Yeah, there you go. You can see what's happening. I don't become impatient and attempt to blend any of this. I know it'll do what it needs to do on its own. What I can do now is I can go back to this area and continue to develop it. So what will my approach be over here? First, I'd like to take my kneaded eraser and get rid of some of these pencil lines, because these are very light, these little things over here, and yellow, and the pencil lines might be distracting. Then I'm going to mask out what I've already done and continue to work in additional ones, and I may start to introduce the filaments. Using my kneaded eraser, I very gently, I don't go crazy, no need to go crazy, I just want to diminish the intensity of that pencil line. Always remember that once you watercolor over a pencil line, it's there permanently. But by erasing pencil lines during the process of developing the painting, you will get rid of exposed pencil line. Just be careful, because you don't want to lose your drawing. To apply the masking, I use Pabio drawing gum, and I pour some in this type of container with a little needle tip. This allows me to dispense controlled amount easily. I always clean my brush. I find this works well in Windex, plain ordinary Windex. And I never use a good brush because inevitably you're going to destroy your brush. Although I'm finding with this Windex, my brushes for masking are lasting a lot longer. Much better than just plain soap and water. It might be the ammonia content of the Windex that's making it go really nice. Put little beads of drawing gum over the yellow areas. See how simple that is? I could even start to draw in the filaments using this tool rather than a paintbrush. I get an exceptionally fine, beautiful line. Little bubbles like that can be annoying. The drawing gum starts to dry up real quick, and I get a little dry area on the tip that can be problematic. It's problematic because what happens is it's going to want to stick to anything drying on there and pull the masking in a funny way. I'll always wipe the tip. If you use this kind of device, you have to be careful that you don't get a huge flood of masking. That would not be good. To apply masking with the brush, always dispense a small amount onto a plastic surface and never work from the original open bottle of masking fluid. If I need to apply a large amount of masking, I'll pour a quantity onto a plastic container, and I never return leftover masking back into the original container when I'm finished. I always discard used masking fluid. To clean this brush, I squish it around in the Windex, then I'll take it over to my sink and work out any dried masking that's gotten into the brush itself. For some reason, the Windex makes the brush real slippery and the dried masking comes right off. A couple of extremely important points in regard to masking. Masking must only be applied to a 100% dried surface. If the paper is damp, and you apply masking, you ruin your piece. The masking is going to get into the paper and you're never going to be able to remove it successfully. The second key point, allow the masking to be 100% dry before you resume painting in that area. Otherwise, you run the risk of dampening the masking and moving it around and just make it a complete mess and losing any of the detail that you intended to achieve. Number 3, don't attempt to accelerate the drying of the masking material by putting it in sunlight. Sunlight will very quickly break down the masking material, and instead of having a nice film that you can peel off, you're going to have a gooey, sticky substance that cannot be removed from your painting, and it's going to ruin it. What's happening here is as these dry, now I can point that out, look at that, all of that beautiful variation, that's because I splattered into it. Same thing is happening on this petal. That's the look I wanted to achieve. I didn't want a flat painted surface. I wanted a nice, rich, textural surface. To start painting this area, I think I'm actually going to start with the orangish green part of the closed flower in the bud. It has very subtle transitions in orange and green. I'll begin with the orange. I jump around with my brush stroke to create a suggestion of tonal differences. And I want it to stay relatively wet. The baby flower that's about to come out has a slight greenish cast towards that part of the bud. As we move up, it has a very slight reddish cast in this area that I definitely want to get in. Even down here, little hints of red. This is where I do work with the tip of my brush, but I'm only touching the paper. I'm not brushing it into the paper. Good. That's all I want to do. The green bud over here, same thing with here and throughout most of the foliage area, is a combination of Windsor yellow and cobalt blue. And also I like to begin with a foundation of cerulean blue. And I have my green mixed. That is cobalt blue and Windsor yellow. I start with the Windsor yellow, and I gradually add blue to get the various degrees of lightness or darkness that I want in the color. Here's the same mixture, only with more blue added. Here's a beautiful green, one of my favorite greens, a very rich foliage green. It's a mixture of Windsor yellow and ultramarine blue. Cerulean blue seems to be the undercolor in these green shapes, so I'm going to work that throughout. I'm applying a mixed light green, which is a combination of cobalt blue and Windsor yellow. This color will help adjust the tiny leaf to a natural green color. Now I'm working in a mixture of ultramarine blue and Windsor yellow. I'll work that in, I'll work that up here. I drag that down. Wet into wet. I don't always use very wet colors. Sometimes I want a much drier color on my brush, stronger color, that I can make a line or a shade that bleeds in, but with more control, like you see over here. But I'm not blending. I'm applying pigment, but I'm not blending the pigment. That I'm going to allow to do its own thing. Okay, let's leave that alone. Moving back to the petals on either side are completely dry. I pre-dampened the one that I'm working on and washing in Windsor yellow with a small amount of cadmium scarlet added to it, carefully brushing the mixed color into the dampened surface. I've added more cadmium scarlet to the Windsor yellow to create a more orange color. And I flow that color in and allow it to blend on its own without intentionally using my brush to blend it. Some plain water to pull that area of lightness in. I'm going to pick up a little more of that cadmium scarlet, add it to my palette. Perfect, that's the orange I want. And I'll flow that while all of this is nice and wet. Flow that into here. Because I know it's going to bleed in an absolutely beautiful way. And that's what I want. I want rich variation from petal to petal. Now the interior area where you get this beautiful red variegation. I'm using my standard quinacridone magenta. And I look at the shape, kind of play with it and feel it, and pull it out. Leave it alone. Going to allow it to start to blend on its own. In this area, it also gets darker like you see here and here, so I will go to my mixture of cobalt blue and quinacridone magenta that gives me a beautiful purple, and I'll add that in right there. So you watched me lay in these petals over here, and I still have these to go, and of course all of the background. You watched me begin to place the stigma, the anthers, the filaments, and then after it was dry, I covered them with protective masking material. What I will do is continue to develop the flower and the rest of this area. To continue with the anther, I'm going to go right into my aureolin yellow. And I just squirted a little water in there so I can get a light wash of the color. And I'm looking at my source photograph, and I'll continue to add little tiny dots of this. What's good about the masking, it's going to protect what I initially did. So with this additional layer, I'll eventually create the illusion of a compounded area of yellow forms, very closely resembling how it actually looks on the flower itself. While I'm at it, I should also continue with this area over here, the stigma. What's interesting about a flower is it has the same amount of stigma, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as it has petals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for that, I'm going to continue with my very strong cadmium scarlet. Get some of that cadmium scarlet. Beautiful, intense red. This is why I like these little bins. It allows me to keep a quantity of color very pure. Everything will become apparent when I remove the masking, and you see how we have a nice compounded statement here. One thing that I haven't mentioned, and it's extremely important, is to keep your water clean, your cleaning water. Because if it's dirty, you pollute the color. And I should note that I never use the cleaning water to wet my paint. I either dispense water from a squeeze bottle, or what I prefer to do lately is simply mist it in with a bottle like this. So I always have a supply of clean water. Flowing Winsor yellow into the pre-dampened surface. My yellow is a lot more saturated. So what I'm doing is I'm working in just a clean brush, slightly dampened brush, to thin out that saturated color. Now to apply the stronger orange. You really just have to go for it. Not worry about it too much. And not become obsessed with controlling what the watercolor is going to do. And I want to get a little of that magenta up in this area and around here. Let's drop down to here and begin to lay in some more of the green. The green that I'll use in this area is the light mixture of cobalt blue and Winsor yellow. It's a nice all-over undercolor. I see, though, as it moves closer to the flower, that color takes on quite a bit of a cerulean touch into the dampened surface. I'll add my cerulean blue. And I want to hit that area with a darker color. To create the deep red center part of the flower, I'm using a mixture of quinacridone, magenta, and cobalt blue. Leave it alone. I see some wonderful hints of cerulean blue. Now the lighter value, almost yellow, with a green tint. I like to have my brush dance around. I don't know why I do that, but why not? Here, I could even begin at this initial stage to work in some of the darker greens. I'm working a mixture of ultramarine blue with Winsor yellow into the colors that I just applied and are still wet. Dropping in cerulean blue, and into that Winsor yellow, and allowing the colors to blend on their own. Some darker brush strokes of French ultramarine blue and Winsor yellow. I'm flowing cerulean blue into dampened paper. I place the cerulean blue where I see it on the leaf in the photo. Now I'm working in a light mixed green into the still wet cerulean blue. Yeah, I'll get some of this beautiful color along the edge. Good. Yeah. It's getting time to buy another Series 7. You have reached the end of How to Paint the Orange Hibiscus Flower Part 1. Please watch Part 2 and 3 for the continuation and conclusion of this watercolor painting series. Thanks for watching Part 1 of the series.